Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet walk through the shadows of history. Tonight, we're not just exploring the grand halls of Georgian England, we're stepping behind the curtains, into the secret rooms where the powerful lived out their forbidden desires. On the surface, 18th century London was a picture of refinement and order. Men wore powdered wigs, women laced themselves into corsets, and society moved to the rhythm of politeness and restraint. But beneath that polished surface, something wild and intoxicating was growing, a hidden culture of pleasure, rebellion, and excess that would come to define an entire generation of England's elite. It was a time of immense wealth and growing empire. The aristocracy controlled parliament, trade, and the fate of millions. They owned vast estates, passed laws, and set moral examples for the nation. Yet, in private, many of these same men were creating a world that mocked everything they preached. Behind heavy velvet curtains, they built secret societies where the rules of morality did not apply. There, they could indulge in every fantasy, every forbidden thought, and every act that society deemed unacceptable. These shadowy gatherings began in the coffee houses and gentlemen's clubs of early 18th century London. What started as polite meetings to discuss literature and politics slowly evolved into something darker. In exclusive clubs like White's and the Kit Kat, powerful men gathered not just to talk, but to escape. They drank fine wines, gambled fortunes, and entertained actresses and courtesans in secret rooms filled with laughter and desire. The line between sophistication and sin began to blur. The members of these circles began calling themselves Libertines, men who believed that pleasure was not a sin, but a natural right. To them, morality was a tool to control the poor and the powerless. They saw themselves as enlightened beings, above the rules that governed ordinary lives. Desire became their art. Pleasure became their creed. And secrecy became their protection. But what truly brought this culture to life were the masquerades. Imported from Venice, these masked balls became the perfect playground for temptation. Behind the safety of a mask, a duchess could flirt with a stable boy. A politician could dance with an actress without fear of scandal. Identities disappeared, and for a few hours, London forgot its manners. The opera houses and ballrooms turned into scenes of fantasy and freedom, and sometimes, chaos. What looked like elegance from afar often hid a carnival of vice within. By the 1730s, these indulgences had grown bolder. Private homes were transformed into pleasure palaces. Themed parties took inspiration from ancient Rome, with guests dressed as gods and goddesses, surrounded by music, wine, and elaborate feasts. The most daring hosts even held ceremonies in abandoned monasteries, where candles flickered against stone walls once meant for prayer. The irony was not lost on them, they were turning sacred spaces into altars of desire. Out of this growing culture of secrecy and sin came something even more organized, the birth of secret societies devoted entirely to the worship of pleasure. The most infamous of these would come to be known as the Hellfire Clubs. These were not simple gatherings, they were networks of power and privilege where the richest men in Britain met under oaths of silence. Behind locked doors, they created elaborate rituals that mixed ancient mythology with erotic theater. Members adopted Roman names, wore robes, and participated in ceremonies that mocked religion while celebrating lust and freedom. But these clubs were more than scandal. They were laboratories of rebellion, places where the elite experimented not only with pleasure but with ideas. They debated philosophy, questioned religion, and imagined a world without moral restrictions. Some even believed they were ushering in a new age of enlightenment, one that freed the human spirit from guilt and shame. Yet, for all their talk of freedom, the world they built was one of privilege and secrecy. Only the powerful could afford to live without consequences. Still, their influence spread far beyond their hidden chambers. The libertine spirit began shaping art, literature, and even politics. Painters and poets celebrated passion and the human body. Writers began challenging the hypocrisy of polite society. Even the very idea of personal freedom, so central to modern thought, was partly born from these secret experiments in pleasure. But as history often reminds us, every era of excess eventually meets its reckoning. Scandals began to leak. Servants whispered. Newspapers hinted at the strange rituals of powerful men. The same society that once envied their freedom began to turn against them. What had been whispered as daring and sophisticated now sounded like moral decay. And slowly, the libertine world began to fade into rumor, myth, and scandalous legend. Yet their legacy never truly disappeared. The libertines of Georgian England left behind more than gossip. They forced society to confront its own hypocrisy, the endless tension between desire and duty, between freedom and restraint. In their rebellion, they revealed the fragile balance that holds civilization together. The story of the libertines didn't end with secret masquerades and candlelit ceremonies. As the Georgian century unfolded, their world became more elaborate, more dangerous, and more obsessed with the idea of living without restraint. What began as private indulgence evolved into something that threatened the moral fabric of England itself. By the mid-1700s, secret lodges and country estates had turned into sanctuaries for the elite who craved both secrecy and stimulation. These gatherings were not random nights of debauchery, they were carefully planned spectacles. Invitations were written in coded language, sealed with wax, and hand-delivered by trusted messengers. Guests often arrived in disguise, sometimes by boat under the cover of darkness, to hidden doors built into the sides of ancient abbeys. Inside, torchlight flickered across marble statues of Roman gods and goddesses. Wine flowed like rivers, music echoed through the halls, and laughter mixed with whispers that carried the weight of secrets never to be repeated. The Hellfire Clubs, perhaps the most infamous of all, became the crown jewel of this world. Founded by Sir Francis Dashwood, a man of wit, wealth, and boundless curiosity, these clubs combined philosophy, art, and forbidden pleasure into one strange, intoxicating experience. Their motto was simple but bold: do what thou wilt. To them, that phrase wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. They saw themselves as explorers of human nature, testing the limits of what was possible when all moral chains were removed. Dashwood's private estate, Medmenham Abbey, became their headquarters. Once a sacred Cistercian monastery, it was now a temple of hedonism. The stone corridors once filled with hymns were now alive with the sound of music, poetry, and temptation. In the candlelit halls, members donned robes decorated with symbols from classical mythology. They dined on extravagant feasts, toasted to freedom, and engaged in rituals that blended religion, satire, and seduction. Some accounts claim they mocked church ceremonies, others suggest their gatherings were more philosophical than sinful. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a blurred line between theater and temptation. But beyond the laughter and indulgence, something profound was happening. These men, politicians, poets, and philosophers, were questioning the very foundation of their world. They asked why pleasure should be hidden, why desire should be punished, and why human instincts were treated as sin. In doing so, they unintentionally laid the groundwork for a shift in thinking that would echo through the Enlightenment and beyond. Yet, their experiment in freedom came with consequences. Rumors spread. Servants who had witnessed their ceremonies spoke of strange rituals, masked figures, and forbidden games. The public imagination turned their secret meetings into legends of witchcraft and devil worship. The church condemned them. Pamphlets circulated accusing the Hellfire Club of satanic practices. Whether true or exaggerated, the scandal was enough to shake the foundations of their power. And still, they continued, at least for a while. Dashwood and his companions retreated deeper into secrecy, hosting smaller, more exclusive gatherings. They built underground chambers beneath their estates, some carved into chalk hills, lit only by torches and lined with murals of mythological temptation. Here, away from prying eyes, they explored what they believed to be the purest form of human freedom, the freedom to live without judgment. But even among the libertines, cracks began to show. Power struggles emerged. Some members, once driven by curiosity, became obsessed with control. Others began to question whether their rebellion had simply replaced one form of tyranny with another. Beneath the surface of pleasure, there was tension, guilt, jealousy, and a quiet fear of exposure. What had started as an escape from society was beginning to mirror it in miniature, complete with hierarchies, politics, and betrayal. By the 1760s, the era of open libertinism was fading. Yet, the ghost of that era lingered. The philosophy they created, the belief in personal liberty, in the right to pleasure, in the questioning of authority, didn't die. It evolved. You can still feel its echo in modern art, literature, and politics. From the Romantic poets who celebrated passion over prudence, to the social revolutions that challenged hypocrisy, the libertines' legacy lived on, hidden beneath the moral surface of Western culture. And so, when we speak of the libertines of Georgian England, we're not just talking about scandalous feasts or secret clubs. We're talking about the human hunger to break free, from rules, from shame, from the masks we wear in daylight. Their story is a mirror, reflecting the timeless tension between desire and discipline, between what society demands and what the soul truly craves. Even now, centuries later, we remain fascinated by them, not because of what they did, but because of what they revealed about us. That beneath every age of order lies a heartbeat of chaos. That no matter how refined we become, the ancient fire of curiosity and desire still burns quietly within. So, as we leave the flickering candles of Georgian England behind, remember this: history isn't just a record of what happened, it's a reflection of who we are. And in the hidden chambers of the past, we often find the truth we're still afraid to face. As the flames of libertinism dimmed in the late 18th century, England began to wash its hands of scandal. The whispers that once circled candlelit halls faded into careful silences. Yet, while the masquerade masks were hung away, their ideas, their dangerous, shimmering ideas, refused to die. The libertines had torn open something in the English soul that could never be fully closed again. The Enlightenment had promised reason, but the libertines had given emotion its crown. Their rebellion, clothed in velvet and sin, began to echo through art, poetry, and politics. The same century that condemned them soon found itself obsessed with the passions they had unleashed. In drawing rooms and parlors, writers whispered of forbidden love and the dark side of desire. The world was still pretending to be moral, but its imagination had already been corrupted by curiosity. When the Romantic movement took hold in the early 19th century, its heroes looked strangely familiar. Poets like Byron, Shelley, and Keats, the restless dreamers who lived and loved without apology, were, in many ways, heirs to the Libertine creed. They celebrated freedom, mocked hypocrisy, and embraced the chaos of emotion. Byron himself, with his scandalous affairs and defiant poetry, was called mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He could have easily walked through the halls of a Hellfire Club, smiling behind a golden mask. But the world was changing. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain into a nation of machines and factories. Wealth shifted from the old aristocracy to new industrial powers, and with it came a new kind of morality, cold, proper, and public. The Victorians built their empire on discipline and decorum, pretending to erase the stains of their past. Yet beneath their black coats and starched collars, the same impulses pulsed quietly, waiting for nightfall. In private, the ghosts of Georgian libertinism returned, in art, in literature, and in secret lives. The Victorians read novels by day and hid their desires by candlelight. Writers like Oscar Wilde carried the torch of the old libertine spirit, daring to speak what society refused to hear. Wilde's wit, his defiance of convention, and his celebration of beauty over morality were echoes of an older rebellion. When he was tried for gross indecency, it wasn't just a man being judged, it was the last echo of a century-old war between pleasure and control. But perhaps the libertines' most surprising legacy was not in men at all, it was in women. For centuries, women had been the subjects of their games, the muses, the temptations, the trophies of male desire. Yet through that same world of masquerades and secret clubs, some women learned something powerful: they could claim their own desires too. The actresses and courtesans of Georgian London, once dismissed as outcasts, were among the first women to live independently, to earn their own fortunes, and to choose their lovers freely. They were not just ornaments of pleasure, they were pioneers of autonomy. By the time the women's rights movement emerged in the 19th century, the libertine spirit had found a new voice, one that demanded freedom not for indulgence, but for equality. The question that once whispered through secret clubs, "Why must I obey?" had moved from pleasure to politics. And that is perhaps the greatest irony of all. What began as the rebellion of privileged men against moral restraint ended as a spark that helped ignite the fight for universal freedom. Today, when we talk about liberty, individuality, and the right to choose our own paths, we are unknowingly echoing the same philosophy that once echoed in hidden cellars and candlelit abbeys. Of course, history has stripped away the scandal, but the idea remains, that pleasure, freedom, and thought cannot be caged forever. Still, we must not romanticize them too easily. The libertines were not saints of progress, they were flawed, reckless, and often cruel in their privilege. They lived without care for the people beneath their world of silk and sin. Yet their defiance, their hunger to live fully, forced society to question itself. They showed that progress is never born from obedience, it always begins with rebellion. And so, when we look back on Georgian England, we see two worlds layered over each other. One, the public world of elegance, etiquette, and empire. The other, a secret realm of masked faces, whispered oaths, and forbidden desires. Both were England. Both built the modern world. In the end, perhaps that's the greatest truth the libertines left behind, that civilization itself is a performance. Every age wears its own mask, pretending purity while hiding its passions beneath. The libertines simply refused to hide theirs. They dared to live the fantasy that most only dreamed of, and paid the price history demands from all who break its rules. So, as you sit there, listening in the quiet of your own time, think of those candlelit halls now covered in dust. Think of the music that once played, the laughter that once echoed against stone walls, the secrets buried beneath polite society's feet. The libertines of Georgian England are gone, but their shadows still move, quietly, beneath the surface of our modern lives. And perhaps, somewhere deep within us, a part of that restless spirit still remains, whispering that life, in all its beauty and danger, was never meant to be lived in silence. The echoes of that age may be faint now, but they still hum beneath the rhythm of our own world. Every time we challenge the rules of love, or question what it means to be free, we're speaking the same language those libertines once whispered behind velvet curtains. They were the dreamers of excess, the architects of temptation, and the first to admit that pleasure was not a sin, but a truth, one that frightened those who preferred obedience over honesty. Imagine walking through the ruins of an old Georgian manor. The chandeliers are long gone, the perfume faded, the silk curtains eaten by dust. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, laughter, music, and the soft murmur of secrets shared in confidence. Those walls remember everything. The rebellion, the passion, the loneliness that followed every night of indulgence. Because beneath their bravado, the libertines were human, searching for meaning in a world that judged them for wanting to live without shame. Their downfall was inevitable. Every era that flies too close to its own desires must one day fall back to earth. Many of those once powerful names ended in scandal, exile, or quiet ruin. Yet history, in its strange mercy, forgets their sins and remembers their influence. The way they broke silence. The way they questioned everything. And maybe that's what we carry from them now, not their excess, but their courage. To question what we're told. To live without pretending. To love, even when the world disapproves. Because the story of the libertines isn't just about lust or luxury, it's about defiance. It's about the unending struggle between who we are and who society tells us to be. It's the same war that rages quietly in every age, in every heart that dares to want more than what's allowed. So when we look back on Georgian England, we see not only a time of wigs, wine, and whispered scandal, but a mirror. A mirror showing us that freedom has always come at a price, and pleasure has always been political. The libertines believed that to live fully was to live dangerously. They knew that beauty fades, wealth disappears, and virtue bends to power. But in that brief, glittering century, they also taught us that desire, pure, unfiltered, human desire, is what makes us alive. And maybe that's why their legacy endures. Because somewhere, deep inside the calm order of our modern lives, we still crave the forbidden. We still dream of the mask, the music, the moment when the world's judgment fades, and we are free, just for one night, to be whoever we truly are. As the centuries rolled forward, the grand halls of England grew silent. The wild laughter of the libertines faded into legend, their faces vanished into portraits that now hang in forgotten corners of museums, eyes that still seem to follow you, as if guarding a secret. The powdered wigs, the silk gowns, the whispered oaths, all gone. Yet the spirit that drove them, that restless hunger for something more than ordinary life, still flickers beneath our modern skin. Society evolved, laws changed, morality shifted, but the human heart remained untamed. The same contradictions that haunted the Georgian libertines live on within us. We work, we obey, we play our roles, but somewhere deep inside, we dream of rebellion. We crave to be seen, to be wanted, to be free. Perhaps that's the timeless curse of desire, it never truly dies, it only changes its costume. The libertines lived at a dangerous edge between enlightenment and indulgence. They explored the boundaries of pleasure, but what they truly sought was understanding, a meaning that reason could not provide. They thought, perhaps foolishly, that by shedding the rules of morality, they could touch the divine through experience alone. Some found ecstasy. Others found ruin. All of them found truth, raw, painful, intoxicating truth. History judged them harshly. They were called immoral, wicked, godless. And maybe they were. But they also forced society to confront its own hypocrisy, to admit that beneath its sermons and laws, it too was built upon human weakness and desire. In that sense, the libertines were not just sinners of their time, they were prophets of the modern soul. Their stories remind us that the line between virtue and vice is thinner than we imagine, that progress is not born in silence, but in disobedience. And that sometimes, the ones who seem lost in pleasure are the very ones searching hardest for meaning. When you walk through London today, the traces of their world are still there, in the grand Georgian townhouses with shuttered windows, in the paintings that glow too warmly, in the poems that still whisper of forbidden nights. The city remembers, even if it pretends to forget. And maybe that's why the libertines still haunt our culture, in our art, our music, our stories. Every time a generation breaks away from the old moral codes, every time someone dares to live openly, freely, without apology, that's the echo of the 18th century calling back to us. Because what began in secret chambers and candlelit halls became something much larger, a quiet revolution of the human spirit. The right to feel. The right to desire. The right to define one's own life. They lived wildly, they fell tragically, but they left behind a dangerous gift, the belief that pleasure and thought, body and soul, are not enemies, but companions on the same journey. So as this story draws to a close, imagine the last candle burning low in a marble hall. The music fades, the masks come off, and for one brief moment, the libertines stand bare, not as monsters, but as mirrors. Mirrors of what we all are when no one is watching. Because the real story of the libertines is not just about Georgian England, it's about us. About the part of every human being that refuses to be tamed. And perhaps that's the final irony of their legacy. They were condemned for their sins, yet it was their defiance that made us free. So, remember them not for their decadence, but for their daring. Not for their scandals, but for their courage to live beyond fear. Because in every century, and in every heart, there will always be another masquerade, another night when someone dares to ask, what if I stop pretending? As dawn breaks over the old estates of England, the ghosts retreat. The laughter that once echoed through corridors of pleasure dissolves into silence. The libertines are gone, their names worn away by time, their stories buried under the weight of morality and progress. Yet somehow, their shadows still linger, in the curve of a painting, the melody of an old waltz, the quiet defiance of a lover's secret smile. History likes to divide itself neatly, good and evil, moral and depraved, virtue and vice. But the truth, as the libertines knew too well, has never been so simple. They lived in that space between light and darkness, where reason meets desire, and civilization reveals its hidden pulse. Their scandal was not in what they did, but in what they dared to show, that human beings are creatures of contradiction. We crave order, yet we are drawn to chaos. We preach restraint, yet we long to be consumed. Even now, we build new worlds of technology and progress, but the same hunger burns quietly beneath, the hunger for feeling, for freedom, for the unspoken. We scroll through screens instead of lighting candles, we chase likes instead of lovers, but the desire to escape control remains unchanged. In our own digital masquerades, we are not so different from them, hiding behind masks of perfection, searching for something real beneath the illusion. The libertines understood something that still frightens us, that pleasure, art, and rebellion are not sins against life, they are the proof of it. They lived loudly in a world that wanted them silent. They celebrated the body when others worshipped the mind. They fell, yes, but they fell beautifully, leaving behind a lesson written in passion and regret. And maybe that's why their legacy feels eternal. Because every time a heart breaks the rules, every time someone chooses love over judgment, every time truth dares to speak against power, the libertine spirit rises again. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were human, dangerously, beautifully human. And in their flaws, they left us a reminder that to live without risk is to never truly live at all. So, as the candles of their world burn out in memory, listen closely, can you hear it? The faint sound of music drifting through time, the rustle of silk, the clink of glass, the whispered laughter of those who refuse to be forgotten. Because history, for all its judgment, cannot silence the echo of a soul that lived freely. And somewhere, beyond time's reach, the libertines dance still, in the eternal ballroom of rebellion, where masks fall away, and truth stands naked under the flickering light of human desire. But power, no matter how secret or well-guarded, always carries a cost. As the libertine societies grew more elaborate and exclusive, whispers began to escape their candlelit chambers. Servants talked, letters went missing, and rumors spread like wildfire through London's narrow streets. Tales of masked orgies in ancient abbeys, of priests reciting mock sermons to naked guests, of women disguised as goddesses and men drunk on wine and philosophy, they traveled faster than the truth ever could. The newspapers, hungry for scandal, began to publish suggestive pieces hinting at what the gentlemen of leisure were truly up to. Pamphlets described these secret meetings as hellish rites, accusing them of worshipping the devil himself. It wasn't long before the public began to give them a name that would haunt them forever, the Hellfire Clubs. The most infamous among them was led by Sir Francis Dashwood, a wealthy aristocrat, politician, and visionary, or villain, depending on who you ask. Dashwood was no ordinary libertine. He was educated, charming, and dangerously intelligent. He saw pleasure not as an escape from society but as a way to expose its hypocrisy. He gathered around him a select group of men, poets, artists, lords, and even future prime ministers, and together they transformed an abandoned abbey at Medmenham into their temple of indulgence. They called themselves the monks of Medmenham Abbey, and their motto was as shocking as it was brilliant. Do what thou wilt. To the outside world, it sounded like blasphemy. But to the members, it was liberation, a rejection of false virtue, an embrace of human truth. Their gatherings were not just about sensual pleasure. They blended ritual and art, parody and philosophy. They toasted the gods of ancient Greece, recited poetry by candlelight, and mocked the empty sermons of the church. But like all revolutions, theirs carried the seeds of destruction. What began as a private rebellion soon turned into obsession. Power without boundaries has a way of consuming itself. Members began to compete, not for influence, but for excess. The more outrageous the act, the more celebrated the man. What was once sacred play became dangerous performance. Soon, the masks were no longer just for masquerades, they were a way to hide shame. Broken alliances, ruined reputations, and quiet blackmail began to surface. Servants who once kept silent now sold secrets to newspapers. Lovers became spies. Politicians trembled as their double lives came under threat. By the late 1760s, the dream of the Libertine Brotherhood had begun to crumble. The world was changing. The Enlightenment, that age of reason and intellect, was beginning to give birth to something even more powerful, public morality. The same society that once admired wit and rebellion now demanded purity and respectability. The Hellfire Clubs became easy targets, symbols of aristocratic decay and moral rot. Some members fled abroad. Others quietly burned letters, tore down paintings, and pretended it had all been rumor. But history never forgets so easily. Even after the clubs dissolved, their influence remained, in literature, in art, and in the quiet defiance of those who dared to question authority. Writers like Lord Byron and Oscar Wilde would later inherit their spirit, celebrating beauty, pleasure, and rebellion against hypocrisy. The libertines of the 18th century had lit a fire that would burn long after their ashes had cooled. But what remains most fascinating is not their scandal, it's their paradox. They lived for pleasure, yet built philosophies deeper than any church sermon. They mocked the divine, yet sought transcendence through the senses. They sinned openly, yet exposed the moral lies of their age. Perhaps that is why their story still feels modern, because every generation, in its own way, rediscovers the same hunger, to be free, to feel, to live without apology. So the next time you walk through a quiet English countryside and see the ruins of an old abbey, remember, those stones once heard laughter, music, and the whispers of men and women who defied the world to taste what it truly meant to be alive. As the last torches of the Hellfire Clubs burned out, a strange silence fell over Georgian England. The laughter that once echoed through marble halls and candlelit abbeys faded into whispers of memory. Yet, the ideas they birthed, of freedom, desire, and the courage to question, lingered like perfume in the corridors of history. By the dawn of the 19th century, England had entered a new age, one of industrial smoke, strict manners, and moral restraint. The same society that had once celebrated excess now wore masks of virtue. Drawing rooms replaced pleasure gardens, sermons replaced satire, and behind every smiling portrait lay the buried memory of libertine nights. But even in this age of propriety, the spirit of rebellion refused to die. It hid in art, in poetry, in the restless hearts of thinkers who still longed to feel alive. You could see traces of it in the works of Lord Byron, his scandalous poetry and wild affairs echoing the passions of Dashwood Circle. You could hear it in the laughter of Oscar Wilde a century later, mocking the same hypocrisy that the libertines had once defied. Even in modern times, their legacy survives, not in their sins, but in their insistence that pleasure, thought, and freedom are sacred parts of being human. What makes their story timeless is not the scandal, but the contradiction. They lived in an age that demanded moral perfection yet punished honesty. They dared to expose that lie, to show that beneath the polished surface of society lies the same hunger for meaning, beauty, and connection that has always driven humankind. The libertines were not saints. They were flawed, reckless, often cruel. But they were also visionaries, artists of life, searching for transcendence in the only place they could find it, the human experience itself. To them, pleasure was philosophy, laughter was prayer, and the body was not a vessel of sin but a temple of truth. Perhaps they went too far. Perhaps they broke too much. But in their ruins, we can still see reflections of our own desires, the wish to be free, to feel deeply, and to live beyond the fear of judgment. Their story is a mirror, one that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How much of our virtue is real, and how much is performance? Do we live for truth, or simply to be seen as good? And what does freedom truly mean when every generation still hides its own secret sins behind the walls of respectability? In the end, the libertines of Georgian England were not just rebels against their time, they were prophets of ours. They warned that when society denies human nature, it only drives it underground, where it grows darker and stronger. And when those desires finally rise again, as they always do, the world trembles. So tonight, as we close this chapter of history, imagine the flicker of candlelight across the stone walls of Medmenham Abbey. Imagine the laughter, the music, the echo of ancient words. Do what thou wilt. Was it blasphemy? Or was it simply the first whisper of modern freedom? That answer, perhaps, lies not in the past, but in us. Because the story of the libertines never truly ended. It just changed its mask. As centuries passed, the ruins of the libertine world slowly crumbled into dust, but their echo remained. In the quiet corners of libraries, in old letters sealed with wax, and in paintings that dared to capture forbidden beauty, their presence still lingers like a faint heartbeat under layers of time. Historians tried to label them sinners, philosophers, seducers, heretics. Yet none of those names quite fit. For they were all of those things, and more. They were explorers, not of lands or oceans, but of the human soul. They crossed invisible borders, testing the limits of what it meant to be free. Some found ecstasy. Others found ruin. But every one of them left behind a fragment of truth. Even now, when we speak of freedom, art, or love without restraint, we borrow something from their rebellion. They taught us that pleasure, when divorced from guilt, becomes not corruption but creation. They showed that the body, the mind, and the spirit are not enemies, they are partners in the grand theater of being alive. But perhaps their greatest lesson lies in their downfall. For all their courage and defiance, they too were trapped, not by chains or kings, but by their own endless hunger. The libertines chased freedom so fiercely that they mistook indulgence for enlightenment. In their pursuit of the divine through desire, they often lost sight of the human cost, the heartbreak, the emptiness, the loneliness that follows when every boundary has been broken. And yet, in that tragedy, they became immortal. Because humanity is not defined by perfection, but by the eternal struggle between restraint and temptation, between what we are told to be, and what we truly are. In a way, every age has its libertines. They may not gather in abbeys or drink wine by candlelight, but they exist, in art studios, in poetry, in whispered conversations about love that dares to be honest. Every time someone questions a rule that makes no sense, every time someone chooses truth over conformity, the spirit of the libertines breathes again. So, as the night deepens and the echoes of the past fade into silence, let's leave them where they belong, in the candlelit halls of memory, where desire met intellect, and where sin dared to call itself sacred. They were the dreamers of forbidden dreams, the poets of passion, the philosophers of pleasure. Their laughter once filled England's night skies. Now, it drifts softly through time, a whisper reminding us that the boundaries between right and wrong, sacred and profane, are often drawn by fear, not truth. And maybe, just maybe, that is why their story still matters. Because to understand them, the libertines, the lost, the unrepentant, is to understand the part of ourselves that still longs to live without fear. So close your eyes for a moment. Picture the flicker of candlelight. The music fading. The masks falling away. What remains is not sin, not scandal, but something achingly human, the simple, dangerous desire to be free. But history has a strange way of forgiving those who dared to sin with honesty. Over time, the names once whispered with scandal began to appear in history books, not as villains, but as curiosities, figures who lived too fast for their world, who sought meaning and pleasure when society offered none. Their abbeys may have turned to stone, their laughter to dust, but their ideas seeped into the bloodstream of modern thought. You can feel their influence in every rebellion that came after, in the bohemian artists of the 19th century, in the dreamers of the Jazz Age, in the free spirits of the 1960s who danced barefoot beneath the same moon that once shone on the Libertines' secret rituals. Each generation, in its own way, has repeated the same defiant whisper, "Do what thou wilt." It was never just a slogan. It was a challenge, to live authentically, to shed the masks that society demands we wear, and to embrace the truth that pleasure, knowledge, and self-expression are not sins, but birthrights. And yet, every act of freedom comes with a price. The Libertines paid theirs in reputation, in exile, in loneliness. Their world burned bright, but only for a moment. The flames that illuminated their freedom also consumed them. Even now, as you listen, their shadows linger in the corners of our modern lives. In the art that shocks, the films that provoke, the conversations we still hesitate to have about desire, power, and morality, their fingerprints are everywhere. Because human nature never truly changes. We still crave what they craved, meaning, connection, release. We still wrestle with the same question that haunted their age. Can a person be good and still desire without guilt? Perhaps the answer is not in choosing one or the other, but in understanding that both live within us, the saint and the sinner, the philosopher and the libertine. The tension between the two is not a flaw of humanity, it is its heartbeat. So when you think of the libertines of Georgian England, do not imagine them as monsters or martyrs. See them instead as mirrors, reflecting our own secret contradictions, our hunger for beauty, and our unending struggle to reconcile the body with the soul. Their story is not about debauchery. It's about freedom. Not about sin. But about courage, the courage to live, to feel, and to question. And in that sense, their echo still calls to us across 3 centuries, a soft voice beneath the noise of modern life, whispering the same forbidden invitation. To seek truth. To embrace pleasure. To live without fear. Because history does not just remember what we build, it remembers what we dare. And the libertines, for all their flaws and follies, dared to live in color in an age of gray. So tonight, as the last notes fade and the candle burns low, remember this. The story of the libertines is not just about the past. It is about us. About every soul that ever longed to be free, and every heart that ever chose desire over obedience. Their world may be gone, but their spirit, that wild, untamed spark of defiance, still burns quietly in the human heart. And perhaps that, more than anything, is their greatest legacy. As the Georgian dawn gave way to the age of reason, the libertines began to vanish into history's quiet corners. Their once lavish houses were sold to new heirs, their grand portraits, stripped of scandal, now hang silently in galleries where no one remembers the whispers that once surrounded them. But if you look closely, in the brushstrokes of a Gainsborough smile, in the eyes of a painted duchess who seems to hold a secret, you can still see it, that glimmer of rebellion, that spark of forbidden fire. London moved on. Empires rose and fell, railways thundered across the countryside, and industry began to replace aristocracy. Yet, beneath the polite rhythm of Victorian restraint, the libertine spirit refused to die. It survived in letters, in hidden poems, in the secret pages of journals locked away in dusty attics. Those who dared to read them would discover a truth far more intimate than the history books would ever admit, that even in an age obsessed with morality, desire still ruled quietly from the shadows. Every generation buries its sins, but the soil of time is thin. Dig deep enough, and you'll find the same roots: lust, ambition, curiosity, loneliness. The libertines understood that these were not weaknesses to be ashamed of, but the essence of being human. To them, pleasure was not merely an act, it was philosophy. A rebellion wrapped in silk. Some of their writings reveal a strange tenderness, too. They spoke of love as an act of freedom, not possession. Of bodies as instruments of art, not shame. Of life as something meant to be lived fiercely, even if it meant burning one's reputation to ashes. They believed that the divine was not only found in prayer or in the cathedral, but also in the sigh of a lover, the scent of wine, the warmth of candlelight on bare skin. And maybe, in some quiet way, they were right. Because centuries later, we still chase the same sensations, the thrill of risk, the intoxication of love, the hunger for something real in a world full of pretenses. We just call it by different names now: freedom, passion, self-expression. But the core remains unchanged. The same heartbeat, the same longing, the same dance between darkness and light. When we study them now, it's easy to mock their excesses or condemn their scandals. But perhaps it's more honest to see them for what they truly were: seekers. People who, in their own wild and flawed way, were trying to touch the raw edge of existence. To feel everything, to know everything, to experience what it meant to be truly alive, unbound, unjudged, and unafraid. And maybe that's what makes their story timeless. Because the libertines were not just products of their age, they were mirrors of humanity itself. In their laughter and ruin, their brilliance and decay, they remind us that to live fully is to walk the fine line between ecstasy and consequence. They remind us that even the most polished civilization hides an undercurrent of hunger, for pleasure, for truth, for connection. And that beneath every age of manners and morals, there will always be those who choose to live as though life itself were the most dangerous art of all. Centuries may have passed since the flicker of candlelight danced on the silk walls of Georgian salons, but the echoes of those forbidden nights still linger in the rhythm of our world today. Every love affair that defies convention, every artist who paints beyond the rules, every voice that dares to speak what society calls unspeakable, they all carry the whisper of that same rebellion. The libertines' world may have been draped in powdered wigs and perfumed letters, but their message was timeless, that freedom of the body and the mind are inseparable. They believed that the truest sin was not indulgence, but hypocrisy. And in that sense, they were prophets disguised as pleasure seekers. We tend to remember them as creatures of lust and scandal, yet many were philosophers, poets, and thinkers who asked the same questions we still wrestle with today. Why do we fear desire? Why do we judge those who simply seek to feel alive? And why does every society build walls around the very emotions that make us human? Their stories remind us that morality is often just a mask, one that hides both our virtues and our vices. Behind every law written to control human behavior lies the unspoken fear of chaos, the fear of what we might do if we truly allowed ourselves to be free. But the libertines dared to face that chaos, to embrace it, to live within it. Imagine one of them, a nobleman, his reputation in tatters, standing on the balcony of his country estate as dawn breaks. The night's music has faded, the laughter has gone quiet, and all that remains is the silence of truth. He looks out at the morning mist, his eyes heavy not with guilt, but with understanding. He has seen the face of pleasure, and it is not evil, it is simply human. And that is the essence of their tragedy. They lived too honestly in a dishonest world. They sought to unite the sacred and the sensual, the divine and the earthly, only to be remembered by history as sinners. Yet, deep within their madness was a kind of purity, a desperate, unfiltered yearning to live beyond the reach of judgment. Even now, when we scroll through screens filled with curated perfection and moral outrage, we are not so different from them. We still wear masks, not of velvet and lace, but of pixels and pride. We still crave to be seen, to be desired, to be free, yet we still fear the cost of that freedom. Perhaps that is why the libertines still haunt us. Not because they were wicked, but because they were honest. They held up a mirror to humanity and showed us everything we pretend not to be, our hunger, our contradictions, our fragile search for meaning in the pleasures of life. And so their story continues, not in palaces or secret societies anymore, but in every heart that dares to question, to feel, to live without apology. Because every age has its libertines. And every heart that loves too deeply, laughs too loudly, or dreams too wildly, carries a fragment of their fire. The centuries that followed tried to silence them, to bury their memory beneath layers of moral reform and polite history. But you cannot bury a spark. You can only hide it, until someone else finds it again. In the modern world, their spirit lives on in different forms, in artists who refuse to censor beauty, in lovers who cross boundaries, in thinkers who challenge the sacred rules of society. Every era rediscovers the same dangerous truth the libertines once whispered under candlelight, that the pursuit of pleasure is not rebellion, it is remembrance. Remembrance of what it means to be alive. Their laughter, once condemned as sin, now echoes in the freedom of self-expression. Their defiance, once seen as corruption, now breathes in the art that shocks us awake. And their philosophy, that the body and the soul are not enemies, but reflections, has become the heartbeat of every movement that seeks authenticity in a world of disguise. Yet, their story is not without warning. For even the boldest hearts among them fell, not from lust, but from loneliness. Because freedom, when pursued without compassion, becomes another form of emptiness. Some died young, others in exile, their names fading into gossip and scandal. But perhaps they understood something profound before the end, that true liberation is not found in excess, but in honesty. To live without lies, that was the real revolution. As twilight falls on their memory, the streets of London still carry faint traces of their world. In the soft light spilling from a tavern window, in the laughter drifting from a hidden room, you can almost hear the echoes of their rebellion, a rhythm that beats quietly beneath the surface of time. They are gone, but their energy lingers, like perfume in an empty ballroom, like footprints in the dust of a forgotten abbey. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear their message carried by the wind that sweeps across history. Do not be afraid of who you are. Do not let the world shame you for feeling deeply, for loving freely, for seeking truth in forbidden places. Because the human story was never meant to be written in obedience, it was meant to be lived in wonder. And that is the legacy of the libertines, not the scandal, not the sin, but the courage to live fully in a world that feared life itself. So as the candle burns low and the music fades, let this story linger in your heart. Let it remind you that behind every rule, every judgment, every moral wall, there beats a human heart.